Coming up, another episode of The Deep Dive, exploring radical ideas. A podcast produced by Bob Rash.
That delivers a logical analysis of objective reality, grounded in rational principles. We will explore relevant facts and radical ideas based on the axiomatic principles of identity, causality, and consciousness, on reason as an absolute, on rational self-interest as a moral guide, and on the ideals of privacy, freedom, and justice.
I want you to just imagine something for a second.
Okay.
Imagine a moment in history where a massive, decades-long geopolitical conflict just appears to be completely unambiguously resolved.
Right, totally over.
Exactly. And we are not talking about, years of grinding, painful negotiations in Geneva or whatever. We are talking about a resolution achieved in literally just 12 days.
Which is unheard of.
Totally unheard of. Picture the global sigh of relief, right?
Yeah.
The absolute declarations of victory on cable news.
The parades, the speeches.
Yeah, the palpable sense that a new era of peace has finally been secured in the Middle East. Now, I want you to take that exact same situation, that exact same region, and picture it spectacularly and violently unraveling just 8 months later.
It is, it's the ultimate geopolitical whiplash. You go from what looks like a definitive textbook military triumph,
Yeah.
I mean, the kind they teach in war colleges for generations, to just an absolute, unmitigated strategic catastrophe in the blink of an eye.
Which forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question for this deep dive. Why does an apparent, overwhelming military victory sometimes turn into a devastating strategic failure?
Right.
How do you win the war so decisively on the battlefield, but lose the peace so completely that you end up fighting an even worse war less than a year later?
It's the multi-trillion-dollar question.
It really is. Today, we are looking at a highly specific sequence of events from June 2025 to April 2026. And just a quick reality check for you listening, we're doing this through the lens of a very particular, fiercely provocative source.
Yeah, we are dissecting a Substack article. It was published on April 18th, 2026 by Roberto Rachewsky.
Right.
And the piece is titled, "One Does Not Negotiate with Evil, One Defeats It."
Which, wow.
Yeah, that title alone is a massive neon sign pointing to the author's worldview.
It pulls absolutely no punches. And because of that, I need to lay down a marker right here at the top.
Definitely a good idea.
The author uses highly charged language. He holds incredibly strong, specific political opinions regarding U.S. administrations. He takes direct aim at Donald Trump, his cabinet, the institutional Pentagon, and obviously the regime in Iran.
He spares literally no one.
No one. So our mission today is absolutely not to endorse this author's political viewpoints.
Right. We're not taking sides here.
Exactly. We're not here to co-sign his foreign policy, nor are we trying to, take sides on the political spectrum. We are strictly here to impartially unpack his argument.
Just looking at the mechanics of his claims.
Exactly. We are using his timeline of events to explore the exact strategic failures that he believes led to the total collapse of the June 2025 ceasefire. Okay, let's unpack this.
Because regardless of your politics, right, the timeline he presents is just a masterclass in the disconnect between tactics and strategy.
For sure.
To start, if we synthesize the overarching premise here, this entire document is fundamentally a case study on a structural difference in military philosophy. The author draws a really hard line between what he calls a non-proliferation operation and a regime termination operation.
Yeah, those are two very different things.
It's fundamentally different. And his core argument is that confusing those two concepts isn't just like an academic mistake. It is a fatal error that costs American lives.
Right.
It fundamentally alters global economics, and it dictates the trajectory of the 21st century.
So let's start with the baseline, the event that sets this entire domino chain in motion. Before we can even begin to understand why the ceasefire failed, we have to look at the sheer, staggering scale of the military advantage that the author claims was squandered.
We have to go back to June 13th, 2025.
Right. Israel launches what is referred to as Operation Rising Lion.
And the picture painted here is of an operation that is almost unprecedented in its modern efficiency. It officially lasted 12 days, but the author is laser focused on what was achieved in the very first 12 hours.
Which is wild. The mechanics of those first 12 hours are mind-bending. According to the text, Israeli aircraft, working in tandem with Mossad operatives on the ground, managed to completely blind Iran's air defense network.
Completely.
But here's the detail that really stuck with me. They didn't just jam the radars from the outside using, electronic warfare planes.
Right, the usual way.
Yeah. The author specifically notes they utilized covert drone bases located inside Iran itself.
I mean, think about the logistical nightmare required to achieve that. We are talking about smuggling drone components piece by piece across borders or through ports over years.
Just sneaking them in.
Yeah, assembling them in safe houses, coordinating a simultaneous launch from within the borders of one of the most paranoid, heavily surveilled states on the planet.
It's like something out of a spy thriller.
It really is. And when those drones go up, they aren't just taking pictures. They are physically destroying radar dishes or engaging in localized cyber attacks to shut down the early warning systems.
So the country's eyes are completely gouged out. And while the air defenses are blind, the assassination campaign begins. They don't just hit regular military targets. They specifically go after the top commanders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC.
Right.
The author names Hossein Salami and Mohammed Bagheri. For anyone listening who might think the IRGC is just another branch of the army, we need to clarify that, right?
Oh, absolutely. The Iranian military is split. You have the regular army, the Artesh, which is tasked with traditional border defense.
Okay.
But the IRGC is entirely different. It was created after the 1979 revolution, specifically to protect the regime from internal dissent.
Oh, so they are like the ideological enforcers.
Precisely. And to export that ideology abroad, the IRGC controls its own navy, its own aerospace force, and vast swaths of the Iranian economy.
Wow.
Salami and Bagheri weren't just generals. They were the ideological architects of the regime's survival. So taking them out is like removing the central nervous system of the state.
And it doesn't even stop with the military brass. Simultaneously, they eliminate 15 senior nuclear scientists. Yeah. Then they move on to the physical infrastructure, crippling the key nuclear facilities at Natanz and Isfahan.
Which is incredibly complex in its own right.
How so?
Well, when you hit a facility like Natanz, you are targeting centrifuge cascades. A centrifuge spins uranium hexafluoride gas at tens of thousands of revolutions per minute to separate isotopes.
So they are spinning incredibly fast.
Insanely fast. The engineering tolerances are microscopic. So if a cyber payload or a physical explosive causes even the slightest imbalance,
they just break.
They tear themselves apart from the inside out. It's violent and irreversible.
The result of all this coordination, the blinded radars, the decapitated leadership, the shattered centrifuges, is complete Israeli air supremacy over Tehran within hours.
Hours. And the author deliberately contrasts this 12-hour window with the previous 46 years of history.
That's a huge contrast.
Right. He traces a line starting from Jimmy Carter, running through Reagan, Bush, Clinton, the second Bush, Obama, the first Trump term, and Biden.
So basically everyone.
Everyone. He argues that for almost half a century, American diplomacy, regardless of the party in power, produced exactly one consistent result.
What was that?
It gave the regime time to become richer, time to dig their facilities deeper into mountains, and time to creep closer to a nuclear weapon.
That's a really bleak assessment.
According to him, every diplomatic framework, every sanctions waiver, every negotiated off-ramp just bought the ayatollahs the one commodity they needed most.
And then Israel steps in. and shatters that 46-year pattern in half a day. The author describes a regime that suddenly finds itself completely exposed. A regime that funds proxy armies, fires missiles at commercial shipping, and oppresses its own population is suddenly, to use his exact phrase, strategically naked.
It is a phenomenal descriptor, strategically naked.
It really paints a picture.
It does. It implies that all the defensive layers, all the deterrents they had painstakingly built over decades just evaporated simultaneously.
If I'm listening to this list of tactical victories, the radar's down, the IRGC commander's gone, the nuclear facility's smoking, it makes me think of sneaking into a neighbor's garage and completely dismantling their car.
Okay, I like this analogy.
Right. You drain the oil, you smash the alternator, you take a sledgehammer to the spark plugs. That car's not driving anywhere.
Definitely not.
But here is the rub, and I think this is the anxiety driving the author's entire piece. Is taking out the engine actually enough if the driver is still sitting in the front seat, completely unharmed, holding the keys?
That analogy hits the nail on the head, and the author addresses that exact tension by introducing the concept of a civilizational victory.
A civilizational victory?
Yeah. Taking out the engine was never supposed to be the end state. The goal was to align the preconditions so perfectly that the driver would be forced to abandon the vehicle entirely.
So this was far bigger than just delaying the nuclear program for a few years.
Far bigger. Look at the geopolitical chessboard as the author sets it up in June 2025. Internal leadership is paralyzed. Internal air defenses are gone. But what's fascinating here is the real masterstroke is external.
The proxies, right.
Right. The axis of resistance, which is the network of proxy forces Iran uses as its forward defense, was already dismembered.
Yeah, the author notes that Hezbollah to the north in Lebanon had been decapitated the previous autumn.
Exactly.
Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria, which served as the crucial land bridge for weapons, had fallen in December 2024. Hamas had been reduced to scattered remnants in Gaza.
So the ring of fire they built around Israel was extinguished. The external shields were gone, and the internal sword was broken.
The driver is sitting in the smashed car, totally alone.
With no backup coming. While the population he has ruled with an iron fist watches his power completely evaporate on live television.
Wow.
The conditions for total regime collapse were handed over on a silver platter.
Which makes the very next phase of this timeline so deeply jarring. I mean, if the regime is that vulnerable, if the moment for a civilizational victory is sitting right there, why on earth does a war end just 11 days later?
Right.
This transition takes us away from Israeli military tactics and drops us squarely into the decision-making in Washington, D.C. Specifically, the ceasefire of June 24th, 2025.
This is where the tone of the piece shifts dramatically. It goes from a chronicle of military brilliance to just a scathing indictment of American political and bureaucratic strategy.
The timeline is almost surreal. It is June 24th. The author states that Israeli pilots are literally still in the air.
Still flying missions.
Yes, they're actively operating with impunity inside Iranian airspace, hunting down mobile ballistic missile launchers. And while jets are actively dropping ordnance, Donald Trump announces a ceasefire.
He announces it on social media.
Yes, on Truth Social. The author quotes the Post directly. He posts an official end to the 12-day war. He declares a massive victory, packs it up, and goes home. The author's assessment is brutal. He literally says he left the ayatollahs alive.
The author frames this not as a moment of pragmatic statecraft, but as the single greatest strategic capitulation of the 21st century.
Capitulation. That's a strong word.
Very strong. He is arguing that claiming victory while the supreme leadership of a hostile regime is still breathing, still in power, fundamentally misunderstands the nature of the conflict.
And the piece really digs into the psychology of the commander-in-chief during this window. It portrays a president who is profoundly hesitant, almost paralyzed by the scale of the moment.
Right.
He quotes Trump saying during the conflict, "I may do it, I may not do it, nobody knows what I'm going to do."
Which is such a bizarre way to talk about a war.
The author paints a picture of a reality television host treating statecraft like a cliffhanger episode, while Allied pilots are quite literally dodging surface-to-air missiles over hostile territory.
And that hesitation dictated how American military assets were eventually deployed. The author points out that Trump did eventually commit U.S. heavy bombers to strike the Fordo nuclear facility.
Right.
But he ruthlessly critiques the timing. He says the bombers were utilized as a finale rather than an opening act.
Let's unpack Fordo for a second because it really matters. Fordo isn't a warehouse in the desert. It is an enrichment facility built deep inside a mountain to protect it from airstrikes.
It's basically a fortress.
Exactly. To hit it, you have to use bunker busters. For those listening who aren't military hardware junkies, a bunker buster is a massive piece of ordnance with a hardened casing and a delayed fuse.
It's a beast of a weapon.
It relies on sheer kinetic energy to smash through meters of solid rock and reinforced concrete before the explosive payload actually detonates.
And dropping those requires specialized heavy bombers and incredible precise intelligence. But the author's critique isn't about the capability of the weapon.
What's it about then?
It's about the strategic intent. Dropping bunker busters on Fordo at the very end of the conflict was a theatrical punctuation mark. It allowed the administration to claim they took decisive, heavy-handed action right before they immediately closed the curtain and walked off the stage.
Ah, so it was for show.
Yeah.
But the author doesn't just lay this at the feet of the president. He directs a massive amount of his firepower at the Pentagon.
Yep.
Specifically, he targets Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and the broader military bureaucracy.
This critique of the Pentagon is central to understanding the failure. The author highlights a bitter irony here. Hegseth came into office promising a massive shakeup.
Right, he was the outsider.
Exactly. He was going to purge the military of woke generals, cut through the red tape, and restore a lethal purpose to the Department of Defense.
But that didn't happen.
According to Rachewsky, no. When the actual moment of truth arrived, the institutional Pentagon Central Command, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the massive intelligence apparatus, they delivered the exact same product they have delivered for 3 decades.
He uses a phrase that is going to echo in my head for a long time. He calls it tactical competence in the service of strategic surrender.
It perfectly captures the trap of modern military bureaucracy. The generals knew exactly how to execute the mission parameters. They knew how to coordinate the bomber wings, calculate the payload yields, and turn concrete bunkers into dust.
They are good at the mechanics.
Exactly. But they were fundamentally, categorically wrong about what victory actually means in a geopolitical context.
If I'm listening to this, I am probably screaming at my dashboard right now.
Right.
I mean, why would anyone, let alone the most advanced military apparatus on Earth, declare victory if the enemy leaders are still alive and in power?
Right. Why stop?
Why walk out of the garage when the driver is still sitting there? And that brings us back to the distinction you mentioned earlier, a non-proliferation operation versus a regime termination operation. Here's where it gets really interesting. How does that philosophy dictate the bizarre choices made on the ground?
It changes the entire metric of success. If the Pentagon approaches this strictly as a non-proliferation operation, their scoreboard is entirely mechanical.
So it's just about the hardware.
Yes. Success is measured by how many centrifuges were shattered. It's measured by how many tons of enriched uranium were buried under rubble. It's measured by calculating how many years they pushed back the breakout time for a nuclear weapon.
It's a math problem.
Exactly. Once those specific, tangible metrics are hit, the mission is deemed accomplished. You declare victory, hand out medals, and go home.
Because you broke the engine.
Precisely. But if you view this as a regime termination operation, your scoreboard is radically different. You do not measure success in broken centrifuges. As the author states, you measure it in tyrants toppled.
Tyrants toppled.
Yeah. A dismantled engine is completely irrelevant if the regime retains the structural power and the financial resources to eventually just buy a new car.
That makes total sense.
And that realization brings us to the absolute pivot point of the entire disaster. The economic decision.
The oil.
The oil. Because the Pentagon and the White House viewed this through the narrow, conservative lens of non-proliferation, they were terrified of the broader global consequences.
They were scared of the blowback.
Specifically, they were terrified of triggering a massive spike in global oil prices that could crash the U.S. GDP and ruin their domestic political standing. And because of that economic fear, they explicitly chose to take the one option off the table that the author believes would have guaranteed true victory.
They refused to close the Strait of Hormuz.
Yes. The Strait of Hormuz is the ultimate geopolitical choke point.
For sure.
It is a waterway roughly 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, connecting the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. Roughly a fifth of the world's total oil consumption passes through that narrow gap every single day.
And the author argues that taking the strait didn't require a massive Iraq-style ground invasion. He explicitly says this required no American boots on the ground marching on Tehran. No 10-year occupation, no trillion-dollar nation-building exercise.
Right, nothing like that.
It simply required the political backbone to choke off Iranian oil exports. You board the tankers. You enforce an absolute embargo. And if the IRGC Navy's fast-attack speedboats try to interfere, you sink them to the bottom of the Gulf.
Because if you do that, you don't just break their military hardware, you sever their financial jugular. You completely strangle the revenue stream that pays the security forces, funds the proxy militias, and keeps the regime afloat.
Without the money, they have nothing.
The author's entire thesis relies on the idea that if you strip away their military defense and their money simultaneously, the regime simply cannot stand. The Iranian population, who are already deeply antagonistic toward the ruling clerics, would be empowered to finish the job from the inside.
But they blinked. The fear of $150 a barrel oil and the corresponding political fallout at home paralyzed them.
Totally paralyzed them.
They presented Trump with a menu of options specifically designed to tell a politician exactly what he wants to hear. You get a quick, flashy military strike, 0 American casualties, a declared victory on primetime television, and, as the author caustically phrases it, dinner at Mar-a-Lago by Tuesday.
The bureaucratic instinct for self-preservation kicked in. The author notes with deep cynicism that not a single general threw their stars on the desk and resigned when the ceasefire was announced.
Nobody fell on their sword.
Nobody stood in the Oval Office and told the president that leaving the supreme leader breathing and the oil revenues flowing was an act of strategic malpractice. They chose the diplomatic deal. They chose the off-ramp.
And by choosing that off-ramp, by prioritizing the global stock market over regime collapse, the United States effectively hit the pause button on the war.
That's exactly what it was, a pause.
Which, when you look at history, is a terrifying prospect. What does a dedicated ideological adversary do when you give them the gift of time? This takes us out of the immediate aftermath of the June strikes and into the third, incredibly tense phase of the timeline.
The fatal pause.
Fatal pause. We are looking at the 8 months between the ceasefire in June 2025 and the sudden explosion of regional violence in February 2026.
This is the period of reconstitution, and it exposes what the author sees as the fundamental fatal flaw in the Western approach to diplomacy and conflict resolution.
Let's break down the mechanics of this reconstitution, because the regime didn't just sit in the rubble weeping. The source details exactly how they utilized this 8-month vacation.
Oh, they were busy.
First and foremost, they replaced the leadership. Salami and Bagheri were dead, but the institutional structure of the IRGC allowed them to promote the next tier of hardliners into command.
Right, the next men up.
Then they started rebuilding the hardware. They reconstructed their mobile ballistic missile launchers. Whatever stockpiles of highly enriched uranium survived the bunker busters, they immediately dispersed into even deeper, more hardened secret facilities.
But the most critical element of this 8-month window is that they were not operating in a vacuum.
Right. The author explicitly points out that they leaned on their superpower allies. They actively coordinated with Russia and China to replenish their decimated military supplies.
And we have to ask, how does a heavily sanctioned country do that while the world is supposedly watching?
How do they?
It happens through shadow logistics. Dark fleets of tankers turning off their transponders to smuggle oil to China in exchange for hard currency.
Just slipping under the radar.
Exactly. Russian cargo planes delivering advanced electronic warfare suites or air defense components under the guise of diplomatic flights. The 8-month pause gave them the breathing room to leverage those illicit supply chains fully.
Wow. And concurrently, they used the time to reorganize what was left of their proxy networks across the Middle East. They started funneling new weapons to surviving militias in Iraq and Yemen to rebuild the external shield that Israel had just shattered.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the psychology of this 8-month period perfectly illustrates the central mantra of the author's piece. One does not make deals with evil.
He is incredibly rigid on this point.
Uncompromising. He asserts that you do not negotiate with a government that hangs teenage girls from construction cranes for refusing to wear a hijab. You do not seek diplomatic off-ramps with a regime that has spent 4 decades organizing state-sponsored rallies chanting, "Death to America."
He believes the West is committing a massive categorical error.
Exactly. And the error stems from how Western diplomats are educated and trained.
What do you mean?
Well, the entire post-WWII diplomatic architecture is built on the assumption of rational actors. Diplomats are taught to look for leverage points, to find mutual economic interests, and to offer financial incentives in exchange for security guarantees.
Like everyone has a price.
Right. The underlying premise is that both sides, at the end of the day, want their countries to survive, their economies to grow, and their power to remain stable.
The assumption is that everybody ultimately wants a nice house and a thriving stock market.
Right. But the author argues that applying that specific Western secular logic to the regime in Tehran is a catastrophic miscalculation. He describes the regime as being driven not by economic pragmatism, but by an apocalyptic theology.
That's a huge shift in perspective.
It is. The founding doctrine of the Islamic Republic, in his view, demands the destruction of the United States and Israel as a religious imperative.
He specifically mentions that their legitimacy flows from the 12th Imam. We need to clarify what that actually means because it sounds like abstract theology, but it dictates their military strategy.
Yes, it's very real for them.
In 12er Shia Islam, the Mahdi, or the 12th Imam, is a prophesied redeemer who is hidden away and will return to rid the world of evil and injustice. But the critical piece here is that hardline ideological elements within the regime believe that global chaos, warfare, and the destruction of enemies like Israel actually hasten the return of the Mahdi.
That changes the entire calculus of deterrence. During the Cold War, mutually assured destruction worked because both the U.S. and the Soviets feared the end of the world.
Right, nobody wanted to die.
Exactly. But how do you deter a leadership structure where a significant faction views the apocalypse not as a tragedy to be avoided, but as a divine prophecy to be fulfilled?
You can't. That is the author's whole point. If your adversary believes the end of the world is a desirable precondition for salvation, how can you possibly offer them a diplomatic off-ramp?
You cannot manage them. They are not a negotiating partner across a mahogany table. They are an existential problem to be eradicated.
It's binary.
It is. When Washington offers a ceasefire to a regime with that worldview, the regime does not view it as a gracious opportunity for peace or economic integration. They view it as a glaring manifestation of Western weakness. They see a lack of spiritual resolve.
Wow.
And so the author concludes that the June 2025 ceasefire did not buy peace. It merely acted as an installment plan on the next war.
An installment plan. I want you, the person listening to this right now, to think about how universally applicable that concept is. Think about how often we see this pattern play out in corporate leadership, in domestic politics, or even in our personal life.
Oh, all the time.
Right. You are confronted with a deeply rooted fundamental problem. And instead of doing the incredibly painful, exhausting work of digging that problem out by the roots, you opt for the quick fix.
You take the easy way out.
You slap a Band-Aid on it, you declare temporary victory, and you walk away so you don't have to deal with the immediate headache. But the root cause is still there, festering in the dark. And when it finally erupts again, it is mutated.
It's worse.
It is stronger, it is adapted to your tactics, and it is exponentially harder to destroy. That is exactly what the author is arguing happened on a macroeconomic geopolitical scale. Washington desperately wanted the quick win. They refused to endure the pain of a global oil shock, so they left the roots firmly in the ground.
And 8 months later, the bill for that geopolitical installment plan arrived in the mail.
It did, and the cost was catastrophic. This brings us to the inevitable climax of the timeline, February 28, 2026, the outbreak of what the source refers to as Operation Epic Fury.
The narrative here is one of direct tragic causality. The tactical success of 2025, precisely because it was left incomplete, directly set the stage for the strategic disaster of 2026.
It's a direct line.
A direct line. This time around, the adversary wasn't caught flat-footed. They had learned from the blinding of their radars. They had rebuilt their arsenals with foreign help. And they had 8 months to meticulously plan a targeted, overwhelming retaliation.
The scale of Operation Epic Fury, as detailed in the text, is difficult to really wrap your head around. It is a massive joint U.S.-Israel military campaign.
Huge.
The source states that there were nearly 900 Allied strikes in just the first 12 hours. And remember, the author's writing this piece in April 2026. He notes that the campaign is still raging, with the idea of openly telling reporters they have thousands of targets ahead of them. This isn't a skirmish. It is a sprawling regional war.
But the terrifying difference between the 12-day war in 2025 and Operation Epic Fury in 2026 is the nature of the Iranian response.
Exactly. In 2025, their command structure was paralyzed, and they essentially absorbed the blows.
They just took it.
Yeah. But in 2026, they unleashed absolute hell, And unlike previous historical flare-ups, they did not limit their retaliation to launching missiles at Tel Aviv or Haifa. They reached out across the Persian Gulf and directly, unapologetically, struck American military positions across the entire region.
Which crosses a massive red line.
A massive red line. I want to carefully walk through the geography of the targets the author lists, because understanding what these bases actually do shows you the sheer scale of the intelligence and security failure.
The target list reads like a comprehensive map of the entire American security architecture in the Middle East.
Let's start with Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. The author notes that this was hit by an Iranian missile. Al Udeid isn't just a runway in the desert. It is the forward headquarters of United States Central Command, CENTCOM.
It's the brain.
It is the literal nerve center that coordinates every single American military operation, intelligence flight, and logistical movement from the Levant all the way to Afghanistan. Hitting Al Udeid is a direct strike at the brain of the U.S. military in the region.
Terrifying.
Next, the author lists Al Dafa Air Base in the United Arab Emirates, which houses critical U.S. Air Force fighter wings and Army Patriot missile batteries. In fact, the author explicitly notes that the UAE as a whole was treated as the main target of the Iranian retaliation. The numbers here are staggering. The UAE absorbed over 500 ballistic missiles, 26 cruise missiles, and more than 2,000 suicide drones.
You have to pause and mentally visualize the sheer volume of that ordnance. We're talking about over 2,500 individual projectiles aimed at a single allied nation.
In a very short time frame.
Right. Even with the most advanced Patriot and Theta interceptor systems in the world, the mathematics of air defense dictate that some of those are going to get through. The sky would literally be on fire.
It's an apocalyptic scenario, and the list continues. The headquarters of the United States Fifth Fleet in Bahrain. This facility is home to 8,300 American sailors, personnel, and their families.
Wow.
The source says it took extensive damage across multiple days of continuous barrages. Ali Al Salam Air Base in Kuwait, another vital logistics hub, came under ballistic missile attack. But the target that really illustrates the terrifying reach they developed during those 8 months of reconstitution is Diego Garcia.
Diego Garcia is a critical detail that completely alters the threat matrix. For context, Diego Garcia is a highly secretive, joint U.S.-UK military footprint situated on an atoll in the middle of the Indian Ocean. It is roughly 6,000 kilometers away from the southern coast of Iran.
6,000 kilometers. It is practically in another hemisphere.
It is.
The author explicitly notes that the Iranian strike on Diego Garcia ultimately failed, but only because British air defenses intercepted the threat, and the sheer vastness of the ocean distance degraded the attack's effectiveness. But the strategic takeaway is chilling.
Because they tried.
Yes. The fact that they even possess the capability, the telemetry, and the audacity to attempt to strike on an island facility that far out in the ocean shows exactly how much lethal capability they amassed while Washington was celebrating its ceasefire.
And we cannot just talk about infrastructure and ordnance. We have to look at the human toll, which the author lays out with grim clarity.
Yes, the statistics in the text are sobering. The author lists 13 American service members dead, 140 personnel wounded, many likely with traumatic brain injuries from the concussive force of ballistic missile impacts. He specifically mentions an entire KC-135 tanker crew of 6 killed over western Iraq.
And a KC-135, for those who might not know, is essentially a massive flying gas station used to refuel fighter jets midair.
Right.
It is slow, it is huge, and it is highly vulnerable. Losing a tanker and its entire crew is a devastating tactical and human loss.
Absolutely devastating. And the casualties aren't just military. The author notes that Allied civilians in the UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, and Kuwait were killed by Iranian missiles aimed at the American installations in their cities.
The author is drawing a direct, unforgiving, unbroken line of causality here. He writes that every single one of these casualties, the pilots, the sailors, the Allied civilians, is the direct, foreseeable, and entirely preventable cost of the June 24, 2025 ceasefire.
And then we arrive at the economic fallout, which brings us to the most bitter, agonizing irony of this entire deep dive. Think back to the Pentagon and the White House in 2025. Why did they refuse to finish the job?
To save the economy.
Exactly. Why did they leave the regime in power? Because they were terrified of an oil price spike. They wanted to protect the global economy. Well, let's take a look at the global economy in April 2026 as described by the author. Brent crude oil is trading above $109 a barrel. The risk premiums on insurance have skyrocketed.
They're through the roof.
Global commercial shipping has been completely rerouted around the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks of delays and massive fuel costs to the global supply chain. And the Strait of Hormuz.
The exact same 21-mile waterway that the administration refused to seize in 2025 because it was deemed too economically risky.
It is now selectively blockaded by the Iranian regime itself. The author calls it the largest oil supply disruption in recorded history.
It is the dictionary definition of a tragic irony. The United States government, prioritizing short-term economic stability, avoided taking control of the strait in 2025. And as a direct mathematical result of that hesitation, the reconstituted Iranian regime was able to use that very same strait to trigger an exponentially worse economic disruption in 2026.
It's just a devastating backfire.
It is. The adversarial leaders who could have been cleanly eliminated while presiding over a decapitated, defenseless state in 2025 were instead granted the luxury of time. They rebuilt their forces, and now they had to be fought at the massive, bloody cost of American and Allied lives.
Which is exactly what they wanted to avoid.
Right. As the author pointedly observes, the IRGC fast-attack speedboats that could have been effortlessly sunk while sitting idle in port in 2025 are now actively firing anti-ship missiles at commercial oil tankers.
What does this all mean? We've gone through the timeline, we've seen the tactics and the fallout. If we step back and look at the entire journey of this source material, what we are witnessing is a devastating surgical critique of short-term political thinking. A stunning, historic tactical victory in June 2025. I mean, a rare moment where the military technology, the intelligence services, and the geopolitical alignment all synchronized perfectly was completely squandered.
Thrown away.
It was thrown in the garbage by a profound desire for a quick, telegenic political win. It was ruined by a fundamental, arrogant misunderstanding of an adversary's deeply held apocalyptic goals. And it was paralyzed by a deep, systemic unwillingness to endure short-term economic pain.
Yep.
And the result of seeking that easy, painless off-ramp was a far deadlier, vastly more expensive, and globally disastrous conflict just 8 months later.
The author's ultimate lesson here is stark, and it allows zero room for compromise. He argues that you do not manage evil, you do not contain it with sanctions, and you do not appease it with treaties. You defeat it.
You defeat it.
He posits that by choosing the comfortable fantasy of deterrence over the harsh reality of regime termination, the leaders in Washington simply deferred the violence. They left the dirty work to be done in a second war, fought on the enemy's timetable at 10 times the cost in blood and treasure.
And again, to you listening, I want to reiterate our stance from the beginning. The author's lens is fiercely, unapologetically critical.
He takes no prisoners.
He is taking a sledgehammer to the legacy of the U.S. administration, the entrenched Pentagon bureaucracy, and the foundational logic of Western diplomacy. But regardless of where you sit on a political aisle, the granular timeline of events he lays out provides an undeniably sobering framework.
It really does.
It is a phenomenal lens for studying the deeply complex relationship between military action on the ground and diplomatic strategy in the boardroom. It proves that a victory on a tactical spreadsheet can easily become a catastrophic defeat in reality if the ultimate goals of the war aren't properly aligned.
It raises profound existential questions about the nature of modern statecraft. The author's central premise, the hill he is willing to die on, is that one does not negotiate with evil. He demands absolute civilizational victory. But I would leave you with a final provocative thought to ponder.
Okay, let's hear it.
Something that builds on the reality of this source, but requires us to look at the mechanics of the 21st century. We live in an incredibly complex, hyper-interconnected global economy. Every military action, especially in a region as volatile and resource-rich as the Middle East, threatens global trade networks, microchip supply chains, and the fundamental energy grids that keep civilization running.
Everything is connected.
Everything. So the question is the concept of total victory or absolute regime collapse actually achievable in the modern era without inadvertently triggering the very global economic depressions that politicians are fundamentally elected to avoid?
That is the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it? If you destroy the enemy but you break the global economy in the process, did you actually win?
Precisely. When you are forced to deal with entrenched hostile regimes, where exactly is the line drawn? Where is the boundary between strategic prudence, the desire to avoid plunging the world into a dark age of energy starvation and strategic cowardice?
Leaving a threat alive.
Exactly. The act of leaving a lethal threat alive today only so it can kill your soldiers tomorrow. In an interconnected world, can we even afford the kind of decisive civilizational victory the author demands? Or are we simply doomed by our own economic fragility to keep making bloody installment plans on the next war?
It is a question that offers absolutely no easy answers. But after walking through the ashes of the 12-Day War and staring into the reality of Operation Epic Fury, it is a question we desperately need to be asking ourselves. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives that scroll across your news feeds. Keep looking for the harsh strategic realities hiding behind the flashy tactical victories, and we will see you next time.
That's a wrap for this episode of The Deep Dive, exploring radical ideas, grounded in reality, driven by reason, built on self-esteem, rational self-interest, and laissez-faire capitalism, produced by Bob Rash.
We'll be back next